Welcome to the debate. Right now, your resume, your LinkedIn profile, your professional bio, they are probably all lying about you,
Oh, definitely lying.
right? Or at the very least, they're drifting dangerously far away from the actual truth of your career. I mean, we tend to think of these documents as our professional identity, but they're just polished surfaces.
Yeah, they're the packaging.
Exactly. So today we are exploring the architecture of what lies beneath those surfaces, which is the living professional record, or the LPR. And for those of you trying to visualize the system, don't just think of like a random folder of old performance reviews on your desktop.
Right, it's much deeper than that.
It is. Think of the LPR as a comprehensive, rigorously governed vault of your professional memory.
And, that vault has a very specific bifurcated anatomy. If we look at Module 3 of the source material, the most important structural distinction is the source layer versus the rendering layer.
Yes, that is the core of our discussion today. We're looking at the profound tension between that private source layer and the purpose-specific rendering layer. The central question we are debating is, where does the true essence and value of the living professional record actually reside?
Right. Does the LPR get its primary power from the rigorous private governance of its source layer? Or is its value fundamentally defined and actualized by the dynamic, public-facing outputs of the rendering layer?
It really is the ultimate chicken and egg question of professional identity. I mean, which layer is actually in charge?
I have strong feelings on this, but go ahead and lay out your stance first.
Gladly. So, to lay out my position clearly, the source layer is the foundational locus of professional truth. Period. Everything else is subordinate. The doctrine from the material is explicitly clear on this.
Well, clear is a strong word, but go on.
It says the source layer is private, it is worker-owned, and it contains the unvarnished reality of a professional life. It holds the evidence, the context, claim maps, claim status, privacy boundaries, witness notes, learning, AI provenance, and revision history. That's all in the source layer.
Right. The heavy lifting.
The heavy lifting, exactly. And the absolute most critical rule of the LPR architecture is that an advisor must never let the rendering layer replace the source layer. The rendering layer, which contains those purpose-specific outputs like your resumes, your bios, interview answers, AI-assisted drafts, these are merely byproducts.
Okay, but
Hang on, just to finish the thought. Without a meticulously governed source layer, professional surfaces inevitably drift. They drift into unsupported language, inflation, or just complete erasure. So my argument is that the LPR essentially is the governed source.
well, I come at it from a different way. That is a compelling argument, sure. But have you considered that a source layer without dynamic rendering is nothing more than a locked vault of potential?
A very organized vault, though.
Organized, yes, but totally inert. My perspective is that the rendering layer is what actually defines, shapes, and gives purpose to the source layer. Yes, the source layer provides the anatomical plumbing, I'll give you that. But on its own, it does nothing.
I wouldn't say nothing.
It doesn't act. The rendering process, the active mechanism of asking, who is the audience and what is the specific purpose of this interaction, that is what retroactively dictates what must be captured in the source layer to begin with.
Retroactively dictates?
Yes. It isn't just a downstream output, it is the critical filter. Without the gravitational pull of the rendering layer, the source layer risks becoming just a meaningless, uncurated hoarding of documents.
I see why you think that, but let me give you a different perspective on how these layers actually interact operationally. If we look at the mechanics of the system, all professional services must remain strictly accountable to what actually happened, right?
Right.
And the source layer enforces this accountability through very specific mechanisms. Let's look at the decision and judgment log. Let's make this tangible. Most resumes and LinkedIn profiles only capture the outcome, the what. Like, I launched this product, or I grew revenue by 20%.
Yeah, the rendered verbs. They look great on paper.
Exactly, the rendered verbs. But the actual value of a senior professional isn't just in what they did. It is often in the disasters they avoided. It's in the invisible labor of good judgment.
Which is hard to quantify.
Extremely hard. But the decision and judgment log, which sits entirely in the private source layer, captures the decisions made, the trade-offs, the constraints considered, the risks weighed, and importantly, the ethical boundaries drawn.
Sure.
Let's say a project manager decides not to launch a software update because it compromises user data. That decision doesn't easily fit onto a traditional resume, but it is a massive piece of professional value. The source layer preserves that operational texture before words are ever formulated for an audience. That proves the governance of truth precedes the packaging.
Look, I don't disagree that capturing the invisible labor of judgment is vital. It's essential for demonstrating leadership and risk management. But I have a fundamental question about your hierarchy here. Why capture it at all?
Because it's the truth of the work.
But truth for its own sake is just a diary entry. I mean, you only preserve a constraint or an ethical boundary in a professional record because you anticipate on some level needing to communicate your judgment to a future audience.
Not necessarily.
Come on. You document that you stopped a flawed software launch because you know that in a future interview for a director of engineering role, you are going to be asked about a time you managed risk. The anticipated publication completely shapes the experiment design.
I'm not convinced by that line of reasoning because it implies the audience dictates the truth, which is incredibly dangerous.
It doesn't dictate the truth, it curates it.
Let me use an analogy here. The source layer is like the raw, strictly governed data in a scientific experiment. The rendering layer is merely the published paper summarizing it. If the raw data isn't meticulously governed, the published paper is essentially fiction.
Okay, but
Think of a mechanism from the material like the claim status guide. I like to think of it not as a passive document, but as a strict bouncer at the door of your resume. It literally forces the advisor and the client to label every single claim privately as proven, supported, emerging, or risking before it sees the light of day. The status belongs to the claim itself in the source layer, not to the person or the audience. So how can you elevate the rendering layer when it is entirely subordinate to this kind of foundational accountability?
Okay, that scientific data analogy is a good one, but let's follow it through. Scientists don't just measure random variables in a vacuum without a hypothesis, right?
Right.
The hypothesis, which is the question they want to answer for the scientific community, that drives what data they collect. Let's look at the claim map from the source material. A claim map explicitly connects raw evidence to what the worker may responsibly say.
Right, it tethers the wording to the proof.
Yes, but look at the actual questions a claim map forces you to ask. It asks, what is being claimed, and crucially, what rendering may use it? The anticipated rendering is what organizes the evidence vault in the first place.
I disagree that it organizes it entirely.
But it does. When an advisor looks at a raw project file, they have to ask, what claim might this support for a future board bio or proposal paragraph? Without the rendering layer pulling the information forward, the LPR literally devolves into an uncurated pile of raw materials. The active process of rendering is the organizing principle of the entire architecture.
But wait, if you let the rendering dictate the structure, aren't you just building a system of performative memory? I mean, the source material explicitly warns against treating the evidence vault as a hoard. Yes, but it must be curated based on reality, not just future utility.
Reality and utility aren't mutually exclusive.
Sure, but let's look at how the source layer handles a job title. A title like Operations Manager is incredibly thin. It tells me nothing about the scale, the budget, or the autonomy of the role. To fix this, the LPR uses a role record.
Which is a fantastic tool, by the way.
It is, because it prevents a client from being reduced to a title. But how does it work? It works by recording the actual reality of the work, the scope, the authority, the direct reports, the constraints. It does this privately, deeply, and exhaustively, regardless of whether 90% of that detail ever makes it onto a resume. The governance happens at the point of entry. You establish the reality of the operations manager role first. You don't just write down what sounds good for a future VP interview.
I agree that you don't write down fiction, but why do we say the title Operations Manager is too thin? It's too thin because it fails to communicate effectively to an audience. You build out the rich, detailed role records precisely because you know the title alone will fail in a future rendering scenario. The material literally states that detailed project records and role records are where the strongest renderings begin. The renderings, the interview answer, the proposal paragraph, those are the destination. The governed source layer is just the vehicle getting us there safely.
Okay, I'll admit when I first read the doctrine on this, I wrestled with exactly that tension. But here is where your argument that the rendering layer is the primary engine runs into a massive structural wall,
Oh, what wall?
the privacy layer.
Ah,
The source layer's supremacy is absolutely adamant that the full record is private by default. It does not belong to employers, it does not belong to LinkedIn, and it does not belong to the public. It houses highly sensitive privacy labels. We are talking about evidence marked as redacted, summary only, metadata only, or strictly do not upload.
right.
The source layer's supremacy is proven by the fact that it is a protected, private, worker-owned space. If we prioritize the rendering layer as the engine of the LPR, don't we risk compromising this privacy by default doctrine?
I don't see how. The privacy layer is essential, obviously, but it doesn't exist in opposition to rendering.
I have a fundamental problem with that, though, because the rendering layer constantly pressures the worker to expose the source for public consumption. It's an engine of visibility.
Only if used poorly. But a portfolio, a bio, a public profile, these are all constantly pulling data out of the private sphere. Isn't the private, governed source layer the only true safeguard against the LPR becoming a public surveillance system, or worse, just a permanent employer dossier that tracks your every move for someone else's benefit? If the destination is the most important part, the temptation is to render everything.
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that. Let me tell you why. You are framing rendering as an engine of unchecked exposure, but the rendering layer is precisely what executes the privacy doctrine.
How so?
You just quoted the material saying the full record is private by default. But what is the very next logical step? It's how we safely interact with the professional world. The doctrine explicitly states, the client doesn't need to show the whole record to every audience. The client renders what belongs in the moment.
Yes, but the privacy boundary travels with the evidence inside the source layer. Privacy isn't a later compliance step. It is part of the anatomy of the record itself before rendering even begins.
Exactly. It is part of the anatomy, but it is activated by the rendering process. Let's use a different analogy here. The source layer is like a restaurant's pantry.
Okay.
It contains raw ingredients, some of which are incredibly spicy, some of which are allergens, some of which are expensive and rare. You don't just dump the pantry on the dining room table.
Of course not.
The rendering layer is the chef. It's a dynamic process that asks, who is the guest? What are their allergies? What meal is appropriate? You can have evidence from a highly confidential client implementation sitting in your private source layer. It holds the raw, sensitive truth, complete with do not upload warnings.
Right.
But the rendering layer acts as the filter, translating that raw truth into safe language. It turns the confidential file into a bullet point that says, supported documentation in a regulated client implementation environment. Without the chef, without the rendering process, you can't feed anyone. You just have a locked pantry.
But a locked pantry implies it lacks utility until served, which I don't think applies to professional memory. Let's look at the witness and feedback layer.
All right.
This requires strict consent and specificity. It captures who saw the work, what they actually witnessed, what privacy boundaries apply to their feedback, and whether they are safe to contact. That is incredibly rigorous governance happening entirely in the private source layer, totally independent of any chef or rendering process.
Well, independent for now.
But you are establishing the truth of your network and the privacy boundaries of your peers before you ever think about an audience. The governance comes first, privacy before proof, evidence before wording. The hierarchy is clear.
The hierarchy is chronological, perhaps, but not necessarily a hierarchy of importance. You need the foundation before the roof, but a foundation without a roof isn't a house. It's just a concrete slab in the dirt.
That's a clever way to frame it, but this hierarchy of governance before rendering becomes a matter of professional survival when we introduce modern threats to our memory. Let's talk about artificial intelligence.
Let's do that. Because the threat of AI distortion is exactly why we need a robust rendering process.
Wait, but AI primarily attacks the rendering process. Let's walk through a tangible scenario. Let's say we have a mid-level analyst. They want to update their resume. They take a few bullet points about a database migration they helped with, and they feed it into an AI tool to make it sound more professional.
A classic mistake.
Right, and the AI, doing what AI loves to do, hallucinates. It inflates the language. Suddenly, the analyst's resume says they spearheaded an enterprise-wide data transformation. The rendering layer is highly susceptible to this kind of distortion. It invents claims, inflates authority, and creates generic, meaningless language.
It certainly can if it operates unguarded. AI is a rendering accelerant, which makes it dangerous if it isn't tethered to reality.
Precisely. And what tethers it? The source layer. Specifically, tools like the contribution record. Work is almost always collective, right?
True.
The contribution record forces the worker to privately distinguish whether they led the work, supported it, coordinated it, or merely observed it. This protects against the exact inflation our analysts just suffered from the AI. And crucially, it protects against erasure. You know, saying I just helped out when the evidence shows they actually designed the entire system.
So how does the system manage the AI tool in your scenario, practically speaking?
Through the AI translation log, which lives permanently in the source layer. It captures the date of AI use, the specific source material fed into the prompt, the claims the human accepted, the claims they rejected, and their review notes. The core doctrine states, AI assists, the human governs.
Yep.
But that governance is a historical private act. By tracking the rejected claims, by noting, no, I did not spearhead the transformation, I only supported the migration, the source layer prevents professional amnesia. Without that strict private source layer keeping a permanent receipt, doesn't the rendering layer just become an automated fiction?
That is a very real threat, and your scenario illustrates it perfectly. But look closely at where that AI translation log actually operates within the system. It exists exactly at the boundary of rendering.
Right, it intercepts it.
Yes, AI is explicitly used to help render, translate, summarize, or revise professional language for an audience. The tension you're describing, the human review, the rejection of inflated claims, the active governance, it occurs precisely when translating the source into a rendering. The human isn't governing in a vacuum, they are governing the output.
But they are governing it against the established truth of the source layer. They are checking the AI's shiny new output against the context layer and the evidence vault to ensure the rendering hasn't drifted from reality.
Yes, but the stress test is the rendering attempt. The reality of the source layer often isn't clear until you try to use it. Take something like the learning log.
Okay, explain how the learning log proves your point.
The learning log tracks a professional's skill development over time. It makes a crucial distinction between mere exposure to a skill, practicing a skill, and possessing a mature capability.
Sure.
Now, let's say our analyst completes a basic certification in AI prompting. They put that in their source layer. It might support a private claim of emerging AI literacy. But does it support a public claim like AI transformation leader?
Definitely not.
Exactly, but we don't actually find out until the worker tries to formulate an interview answer or a promotion statement. The rendering layer acts as the ultimate stress test that proves the source layer's integrity. It forces the uncomfortable question, is this claim actually defensible for this specific audience right now? The friction of rendering is what keeps the source layer honest.
I'll grant you that the rendering layer can expose gaps. Attempting to write the resume might trigger the maintenance log, prompting the worker to realize, oh, I don't actually have evidence to back up this leadership claim, forcing them to update the LPR or retire a stale claim.
Exactly.
But exposing a gap is not the same as dictating the truth. The source material explicitly warns advisors not to mistake the LPR for a personal branding exercise. Personal branding begins with how someone wants to be seen by the market. The LPR begins with what can actually be supported by evidence.
I agree that the LPR is not a personal branding exercise, but let's look at how the entire system is assembled. The initial phases of building this record involve identifying positioning hypotheses and value patterns. The advisor and the client work together to translate the raw value of a career into specific market lanes.
Right.
They create controlled renderings to test the waters. All of that purposeful, market-facing translation happens as a core part of assembling the record. The system is entirely built around the reality that professional memory must be purposeful. If it doesn't serve a professional purpose, it's just digital hoarding.
Purposeful, yes, but anchored, unshakably anchored. The living professional record is defined by its governed source layer, because that is the only place true agency lives. It ensures that evidence, context, and privacy always precede wording.
I just think that's a bit rigid.
It has to be rigid to protect the worker. We live in an era of immense pressure for constant public visibility, where every professional is expected to be a brand, constantly rendering their lives for platforms. The source layer protects the worker from that exhaustion. It enforces the boundary that says, we don't owe every audience the whole record. By maintaining that private, worker-owned source layer, we maintain our sovereignty over our own history. The rendering, no matter how perfectly targeted, is just a fleeting reflection of that permanent truth.
LPR only truly lives through the rendering layer. An unrendered record is a silent one. It is the active rendering process that translates governed memory into purposeful professional action. It is the renderer that navigates the complex context, applies the necessary privacy limits, matches the confidence level to the moment, and allows the professional to actually move forward in their career.
It seems we have arrived at one fundamental point of agreement, though. The relationship between the source and the surface requires immense ongoing intentionality.
Oh, absolutely.
The architecture is incredibly delicate. If you mistake the LPR for just a folder of old resumes or a public profile, you build the wrong system entirely. It requires disciplined assembly and maintenance to hold that tension over time.
Absolutely. The maintenance is what keeps it alive. You have to update it after a project ends, after you receive critical feedback, or after you earn a new credential. If you don't maintain both the raw evidence and the understanding of how it might be rendered, you're right back to emergency reconstruction the next time you need to apply for a job or pitch a client.
Exactly. You're back to letting the rendering layer panic dictate your past. We will leave it to our listeners to reflect on their own professional architecture. When you look at your own career history, is it driven by the rigorous foundational governance of a private source layer, or is it entirely defined by the purposeful public act of rendering? Thank you for joining us on The Debate.